In a quiet mountain town, where snow falls like whispers from heaven, a little girl once spent all her savings to save a broken German shepherd no one wanted. What she didn't know was that the dog she rescued would one day rescue her and an entire town's faith. This is a story of second chances, of love that heals deeper than scars, and of a miracle that began in silence. Tell us where you are watching from, and stay with us until the end, because what happened next will make you believe in hope again. The July heat in Silverpine did not shout. It hummed, sunlight glancing off the copper roofs, dust rising in slow spirals from the stockyard road, pine scent lifting from the ridgeline like a quiet hymn. Beyond the railroad, where the fairground banners frayed and the tin loudspeaker crackled to life, the county livestock auction swelled with the easy bustle of Saturday. Men in sweat-dark hats, women with ledger notebooks and citrus perfume, children licking the last sugar from paper cones. A soft wind moved through the pavilion's slatted walls and mixed the odors of hay, leather, engine oil, and the faint, unmistakable tang of animal fear. At the rear of the long barn, where the light fell in pale rungs, a girl stood small and still as a flag at rest. Her name was Lila Moore, 13 years old, but built like a bird that had learned the trick of staying upright in a storm. Narrow shoulders, long brown hair braided with a care that spoke of habit, not fuss. Eyes the exact color of creek water when the sky clears after rain. She dressed in a faded denim skirt and a t-shirt laundered too often, and though her sandals were scuffed, she held herself with a sort of steady, shy dignity, as if her spine had memorized the posture of waiting. Lila's way with people was soft-footed. She didn't interrupt, and she listened with an intensity that left grown-ups feeling oddly seen. It wasn't that she had nothing to say. It was that loss, old for her age, young for the world, had taught her that speaking second sometimes brings truth closer. The loss had a date and a face. Her father, Nathan Moore, a rescue worker with a smile that stayed in the air after he left the room. A spring flood had taken him during a nighttime call 2 years before. Since then, Lila had learned to count courage not as the absence of fear, but as the willingness to hold a trembling thing in your hands without dropping it. She stood now with that same careful courage, watching while the lots rattled by. Steers, a thin milk cow, a surly pony with a scar he wore like an old insult. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Amos Beckett, commanded the floor with a voice like a quick drumbeat and the precise showman's flair of a carnival barker who had read enough scripture to season his jokes. Beckett was 50 if a day, sharp-cheeked, silver stubble trimmed with the obsessive neatness of a man who kept order as a bulwark against a life that had once frayed. He wore a bone-white hat and a bolo tie with a cracked turquoise stone. His gestures were swift, almost musical. People liked him. He'd lost his wife young and never remarried, and since then he treated the regulars with a wry, avuncular kindness, the way a veteran handles a familiar rifle, half routine, half reverence. Beside Lila stood a woman with a canvas bag and the faint medicinal smell of antiseptic soap. This was Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, 62, a retired veterinary nurse who wore her gray hair in a bun that seemed to scold gravity. She had a face that had weathered a great many midnights and a disposition that combined gentle hands with an ironclad sense of right and wrong. Her humor was dry as kindling. Her sympathy arrived without trumpet. She had known Lila's father from the rescue unit, had helped set broken paws and soothe barn cats with opinions, and now looked out for the Moore women, the mother, Elena, and the daughter, without making a federal case of it. "There he is," Mrs. Whitmore murmured, nodding toward a far pen that sat a little apart from the chutes. The pen was smaller, the sign above it handwritten instead of stenciled, as if someone wanted the lot to pass unnoticed. Inside, a German shepherd lay like a statue taught the trick of breathing. The dog was large, even by his breed standard, all sinew and dusk, black saddle fading into smoke-gray flanks, tan dusting his legs like sunrise on stone. One ear bore a nick, a crescent missing that gave him a permanently quizzical tilt. A thin scar traced his muzzle with the delicacy of a pale thread. There was the broad, noble skull of the shepherd line, but the eyes, amber, steady, and inward, held a question, or perhaps the memory of one. He did not pace. He did not whine. He simply watched, as if watching were the last honest work left to him. His name, written on the clipboard hooked to the rail, was Ranger. No age was listed. Someone had scribbled, approx. 4/5 asserts. And then below, in a different hand, unfit, return. An additional note, 3 words and a verdict, had been added in block letters. No adoption value. Lila's breath hitched in the quiet way it did when she read a sentence that tried to close the world. Her father had taught her that words could be gates or walls. She could feel where this sentence wanted to stand. She moved closer, slow and sideways, not because she feared the dog, but because she knew dignity hates to be startled. Up close she could see the weight beneath his ribs was a little low, the pads of his feet a little rough. The coat was clean enough to tell her someone had tried, and had not tried long. Ranger's gaze slid to her like a tide and held. The shift of it was tiny, but it felt to Lila like the sound of a lock somewhere in the distance, a click the heart recognizes before the mind does. She knelt, hands open, said nothing for a time, and then whispered into the space where silence turned receptive. "I see you." Ranger did not rise. His tail made the smallest tide mark in the straw. Elena Moore approached, wiping her palms on her dress in the absent-minded way of a woman who continually moves from one task to another, because stillness risks memory. Elena was 38, tall, with the kind of cheekbones movies pretend to discover, and eyes that had learned the art of kindness even when budgets didn't. She worked mornings at the bakery and evenings on bookkeeping for 3 ranchers. Grief hadn't broken her voice, but it had taught it to bend. "Honey," she said gently, laying a hand on Lila's shoulder. "We can look, but we can't." She didn't finish because she was a practical woman, and practical women know that the language of can't is safest when not spoken in front of a child who has already outlived one kind of impossible. Mrs. Whitmore inspected the clipboard, her mouth flattening when she reached the stamped line that categorized Ranger with the bureaucracy's bluntness. Surplus. "He's been somewhere," she said softly. "Those eyes have a curriculum, and that scar's an old story." "A working line shepherd," added a man from the next pen, Tommy Reyes, a part-time handler with a belly laugh and a quick eye, mid-30s, grease still under his nails from the repair shop. He wasn't central to the moment, but the world often supplies a chorus to a solo. Maybe training didn't stick, or maybe the humans didn't. Lila looked at her mother and then at Mrs. Whitmore, not pleading exactly, but standing on the narrow bridge between hope and the necessary math of groceries. The loudspeaker popped. "Lot 57, called Amos Beckett, his words loping the way auction words do. "Mixed-use dog, condition unknown, must move today. Who'll start me at—" A low number. Even for a dog, it felt like an insult disguised as an estimate. The crowd shifted. No one raised a paddle. The silence had a bored quality, the way silence does when people believe they are watching nothing happen. Lila lifted her small hand. The gesture was measured, almost ceremonial. There was a tremor in it, but the tremor steadied as the air touched her fingers. "We have the back," Beckett announced, interest warmed by surprise. His eyes tracked the pavilion and then found her, this slight girl with creek-water eyes and a wide, grave stillness. He softened, almost imperceptibly. "Do I hear—" A pair of ranch boys at the rail snorted, one muttering that junk dogs make junk trouble, the other opining that shepherds with bad starts often turned mean. Mrs. Whitmore fixed them with a look so dry it could have cured ham, and their commentary arced away like a spark landing in wet grass. Beckett called the next number down. A woman in pearls lifted a finger, and then withdrew it when she saw the dog's pen up close. A man in a blaze-orange cap asked if the county would take him back if he bit. The bids rose a notch, then stuttered. Lila's savings purse weighed like a stone against her thigh. The odd coins from chores, the crumpled bills earned helping Mr. Lennox sweep the feed store after school, the birthday money she had not spent on anything, and had perhaps been saving for this without knowing the name of this. She raised her hand again. Elena's breath left in a long, careful stream. The number Lila committed was everything she had and a small prayer on top, the kind of figure that feels too large when you are a child, and too small when what you are buying is a life. There was a pause in the room, as if the barn itself had decided to watch. "We have the back," Beckett repeated, slower now, respect creeping into the cadence. He looked for a counter, found none, and lifted the gavel. "Going once." The gavel's shadow crossed the table like a cloud over wheat. "Going twice." A hand moved near the front, hesitated, fell. "Sold," Beckett said, and let the gavel fall with a crack that sounded to Lila like the breaking of a curse. "Sold to the girl in the back." Laughter brushed the rafters, surprised, not cruel, and then conversation started up again, louder than before, because relief always talks. Lila swallowed the way a person swallows after running on stones barefoot. Elena covered her daughter's hand with her own. "We'll make it work," she whispered, and though she had no plan yet, the tone of her voice was the tone a bridge uses to stand. At the paperwork table, the county clerk wore a look of stern mercy, as though kindness were an indulgence her job allowed only in homeopathic doses. "Parent or guardian has to sign," the clerk said, tapping the line as if punctuation were a matter of ethics. Lila's face did not fall. It drew inward like a lamp turned low to save oil. Before the ache could settle, Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward. "I'll sign," she said, her voice brisk as a folded sheet. "Agnes Whitmore, neighbor and longtime acquaintance of the Moore family. I'll vouch." She produced her ID with a magician's efficiency and her reading glasses with the annoyed affection of a woman who loved efficiency, but had made a practical peace with time. The clerk considered the name, the county knew the Whitmores, and nodded. "You understand," she began, "that an animal marked unfit—" "I understand unfit," Mrs. Whitmore replied, her eyes slanting for just a second toward the pen where Ranger lay. "I've seen it on forms and on faces. This one is neither." She signed. The pen scratched a small covenant into being. Beckett approached just then, hat in hand, which was not a thing he did for most transactions. Up close you could see the laugh lines that had been pressed into service as worry lines more than once, and the small scar at his temple earned during a rodeo in his callow youth. No pun intended. "Miss Moore," he said to Lila, "that was clean bidding. Your daddy would be—" He halted, sensing the tender edge he had put his boots too near. He shifted, let his voice find a tone like warm wood. That was something to be proud of. He knelt, not making a show of it, just meeting the dog's gaze square as a promise. "Ranger, is it? Well then, son, you've been reassigned." Ranger stood in that deliberate joint-by-joint way of animals who have learned that standing is a decision, not a reflex. Up close, he was larger than the pen had made him seem. He sniffed Beckett's wrist, the air around Lila's hands, the hem of Elena's dress. When Lila's fingers reached the fence, his nose touched them with a gravity that felt like agreement. The world did not tilt into a movie miracle. No orchestra swelled. But something did move, quiet as a hinge that has been oiled just enough. They led him from the pen on a simple rope because proper gear would come later, because sometimes the next right thing is done without the ceremony of being fully ready. Outside, the wind had freshened. The banners rattled like brave laundry. Ranger kept his head low, ears mapping each new sound. A passing boy offered a jerky stick with a grin. Ranger ignored it, not disdainful. Simply not yet returned to the country where appetite makes sense. Lila walked at his shoulder, matching his pace without thinking, the way a dancer matches a lead when the music is only in the bones. At the truck, Mrs. Whitmore laid a blanket in the bed with the same formal tenderness she used to make a hospital corner on a kennel cot. Elena climbed into the cab and rested her forehead a second on the steering wheel, saying a small, private sentence to the man who should, in a better world, have been here. Lila looked back at the pavilion, the dust, the slats, the place where numbers become judgments, and sometimes, if you're lucky, mercy. Ranger's gaze followed hers, then slid to the horizon, where the black-green line of the pines held up the sky like a faithful arm. She leaned and whispered, not quite sure why the words came as they did, only sure they were the right shape. "Ranger, you're safe now." He did not wag, he didn't need to. He merely settled his weight, a fraction closer to her foot, and let the breath out slow. It felt to Lila like a key turning. Mrs. Whitmore, after double-checking the latch, turned back to the clerk with one last signature flourish. "All set," she announced, voice brisk but eyes bright with something that looked suspiciously like relief. She caught Lila's glance and added, less briskly, "We change one life at a time, kiddo. That's how the big jobs get done." The sun had slid an inch westward, the heat gentled. Elena pulled onto the road, and the truck's shadow moved alongside them like a loyal thing. Behind, the fairground returned to its rhythm. Ahead, the town waited with its weathered porches, its steep church steps, its kitchen tables, where news was folded into the day like flour into batter. On the bench seat, Lila kept one palm open. And in the bed, the German shepherd lay with his eyes half closed, the wind working his fur into small, reassuring waves. The day did not change its name, but for the girl and the dog, the story had turned a page. The morning mist over Silverpine had the color of milk poured into tea, thin, patient, and faintly glowing. From the ridge above town, the pines slanted downward like green spires reaching for prayer. The Moore cabin sat among them, a modest wooden house where smoke rose from the chimney in a careful thread, reluctant to disturb the quiet. It was the kind of morning that smelled of pine sap, wet earth, and something unfinished. Inside, the rhythm of a small life unfolded, a kettle whispering on the stove, the slow scrape of a chair, the soft tap of a child's bare feet on cold planks. Lila Moore moved through the kitchen with the sleepy precision of habit. She wore her father's flannel shirt like armor, its sleeves rolled high on her thin arms. Her hair, still mussed from sleep, caught the dawn light that filtered through lace curtains. The cabin's walls were lined with relics of another time, photographs of a man in a rescue uniform. A coil of rope hung beside a rusted lantern, and a framed quote he once loved. Faith is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving anyway. Her mother, Elena, was at the sink washing a single plate, the kind of task she stretched just to stay busy. She was tall and still beautiful in the quiet way grief carves into a person, softer, steadier, more deliberate. She spoke little in the mornings. Her words came alive only once the day required them. The absence of Nathan Moore hung between them like a presence, his boots still near the door, his old rescue jacket folded neatly on a chair that no one used. Ranger lay outside the screen door, curled on a faded quilt. The German shepherd's coat had regained a faint sheen, though the ribs beneath still pressed lightly against his skin. His ears twitched with each sound, a jay's call, the distant hum of the sawmill, the snap of a branch under a deer's hoof. But he did not bark. He rarely did. He watched as though the world might one day explain itself if he were patient enough. Lila poured oatmeal into 2 bowls, setting one by the door where Ranger could see. "You should eat," she said, half to him, half to herself. The dog lifted his head, amber eyes steady, and then lowered it again. The spoon in her hand wobbled. "He's still adjusting," said Mrs. Whitmore's voice from the porch. The woman stood wrapped in her wool cardigan, her hair pinned back with 2 mismatched clips. She carried a small paper bag of herbs and vitamins from her days as a vet nurse. "Give him time, sweetheart. Some wounds aren't on the body." Lila nodded. "He hasn't eaten since we brought him home." Mrs. Whitmore crouched beside Ranger, her knees creaking like old hinges. She laid her palm gently on his back, feeling the slow rise and fall beneath the fur. "See that? He's listening. Just needs to learn the language of safety again." The phrase landed in Lila's chest like something familiar. The language of safety, she repeated softly, tasting the words. After breakfast, Lila slipped on her boots and stepped into the crisp air. Ranger followed, not close, but not far either, a silent shadow between trees. The path behind their cabin led to what had once been Nathan Moore's training yard. The fences stood crooked, the small shed still bearing his handwriting, patience before precision. It had been 2 years since the last bark echoed there. She stood at the edge of the pen and whispered, "He used to train dogs here for rescue missions. They said he could talk to them without words." Ranger sniffed the ground, circling the faded tracks in the dirt, his tail lowering as if recognizing something sacred. He stopped before an old wooden crate and lay down beside it, eyes half closed. That afternoon, the sky dimmed with sudden rain. It came quick and steady, drumming on the roof like applause from heaven. Lila sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through her father's notebook. The cover was worn smooth by use, edges darkened from oil and time. Inside, his handwriting slanted forward, each line full of practical notes, search patterns, hand signals, phrases of encouragement. But near the back, she found something stranger. One small page written differently, slower, as if whispered onto paper. "When a dog loses trust, no command will reach him. Don't call his name with your mouth. Call it with your heart." The page trembled slightly in her hands. She looked toward the door, where Ranger lay motionless, rainwater beading on his fur. She stepped closer, crouching until they were eye to eye. "Ranger," she said quietly, the name barely more than breath. Then, softer still, You're safe now." The sound was not dramatic. It was a small ripple on a still pond, but something in Ranger's body shifted, his head lifting, ears angling forward, eyes clearing like a window wiped clean. He sniffed once, twice, then rose with careful grace. When Lila extended her hand, he pressed his nose into her palm. The gesture was tentative, yet true. Elena, watching from the doorway, felt her throat tighten. The scene unfolded like an answered prayer she had forgotten she'd prayed. Over the next days, life found a rhythm that almost resembled peace. Ranger began to eat, a little at first, then with quiet focus. Lila brushed his fur each morning, humming songs her father used to sing on long drives. Old country tunes and half-remembered hymns. The house felt warmer, not from the stove, but from the simple fact of presence. The sound of paws on the porch, the thud of tail against doorframe. One evening, while the sun leaked gold across the pine needles, Elena stepped outside with 2 mugs of cocoa. She handed one to her daughter, watching Ranger chase a leaf skittering in the wind. "Your dad would have liked him," she said. Lila smiled. "He feels like something Dad left behind." "Maybe," Elena replied softly, eyes on the horizon. "Or maybe he's something God sent after." The conversation ended there, not from lack of words, but because the moment felt full enough already. As the days grew longer, Lila began reading aloud from the notebook each night before bed. Ranger would curl beside her, his breathing syncing with her voice. She learned about commands, search signals, and the quiet rituals of partnership. How rescue work wasn't about obedience, but about faith shared between species. Yet, beneath that calm, grief still hummed. Some nights Lila would wake to the sound of wind and imagine it was her father's voice outside, calling through the trees. Ranger would lift his head, ears flicking, as if he heard it too. On one such night, she tiptoed to the window. The moon hung low, pouring silver onto the clearing. Ranger stood at the edge of the yard, staring into the forest. Lila whispered his name. He turned, and in his eyes she saw not fear, but recognition. 2 beings, both once lost, now learning how to belong again. The following morning, Mrs. Whitmore visited with supplies, antiseptic, a proper collar, and a tin tag etched with Ranger Moore Family. "It's official," she said with a proud smile. "He's home." Lila fastened the tag and whispered, "Welcome back." The metallic jingle that followed felt like a benediction. That evening, rain came again, gentler this time. Lila sat by the window, Ranger's head resting on her knee. The world smelled of wet pine and old memory. She thought of her father's final note, of calling with the heart, and understood it at last. Faith was not about command, it was about communion. When Elena came to turn off the lamp, she paused at the sight, her daughter asleep, her hands still on Ranger's back, their breathing one slow rhythm. The mother smiled, half in sadness, half in awe. For the first time since the flood, the house no longer felt empty. Outside, the rain softened into mist, and the pines stood sentinel under the moonlight. Somewhere, unseen, the world exhaled, one story ending so another could begin. The summer storm came without warning. It began as a breath of warm air, carrying the scent of pine needles and soil, and then turned into something alive. Dark clouds rolling like restless animals across the ridge, thunder murmuring low in its throat. By the time the first drops hit the tin roof of the Moore cabin, the world had narrowed to silver lines and the steady drumming of rain. Inside, the house glowed amber from a single oil lamp. The windows rattled in their frames, but it was not fear that filled the air. It was waiting. Lila sat cross-legged beside Ranger, who lay on an old quilt near the hearth. He had been improving for weeks, his appetite returning, the dullness leaving his eyes. But that afternoon, he had grown strange again. Uneasy, restless. His breathing had turned quick, too quick. He had paced the room in tight circles, nails clicking on wood like a ticking clock, then collapsed without a sound. Now he lay trembling, paws twitching, body jerking as if his dreams were full of invisible battles. "Mom!" Lila's voice cracked through the thunder. Elena ran from the kitchen, apron still in her hand. The look on her face wasn't panic. It was the frozen calm of someone who has learned what helplessness feels like and fears it more than pain. "What's happening to him?" Lila cried, kneeling beside the dog. Ranger's legs stiffened, and a low whine escaped his throat. His eyes rolled, unfocused, and for a heartbeat, Lila thought she was watching him slip away. "Stay with me," she whispered, her fingers trembling on his fur. "Ranger, stay." Elena grabbed a blanket, trying to steady him, her hands shaking despite her composure. "He's seizing, honey. It looks like a seizure. How do we stop it?" Before Elena could answer, there came a knock, a sharp, urgent rhythm on the front door. When she opened it, Mrs. Whitmore stood there, rain plastering her gray hair against her forehead. In her hand was a worn leather bag, the kind doctors carried in old movies. "I saw your lights," she said, stepping in before being invited. "Thought you might need a hand." She dropped to her knees beside the dog, her movements calm, practiced. "Good boy, Ranger," she murmured, her voice low and even. "You just ride it out now, that's right." She placed a towel under his head, careful to keep her hands away from his teeth. Lila clutched her mother's sleeve. "Is he going to die?" "Not tonight," Mrs. Whitmore said firmly. "He's been through worse. The body remembers pain, but it also remembers how to fight." The storm raged outside, wind clawing at the shutters, but inside the small cabin, time slowed. Minutes passed, 5, 10, 15, until the tremors eased. Ranger's breathing steadied, his muscles relaxing, his tail twitching faintly. When the last shudder left his body, he lay still, eyes open but glazed. Lila stroked his side gently, afraid to move, afraid he might break if she let go. Mrs. Whitmore wiped her hands and leaned back on her heels. "That's it. He's past the worst of it. Now we wait." Elena fetched towels and a bowl of water, her face pale but steady. "What happened?" "Looks like idiopathic epilepsy," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly. "I've seen it before in working dogs. Some of them hide it well during training. Others," she sighed, "others aren't so lucky." The words settled like dust. Lila swallowed. He was a working dog? More than likely. The way he listens, the scars, the way he doesn't panic when thunder hits. He was trained for something. Search and rescue, maybe service work. She looked at Ranger, whose gaze was distant, as if he were somewhere far away. But once a dog gets sick, programs drop them. Costs too much to care. Lila's throat tightened. They just throw them away? Mrs. Whitmore's eyes softened. They don't all have a Lila Moore to buy them back. Outside, lightning flashed, cutting the forest in half with white fire. The thunder followed, deep enough to shake dust from the rafters. Ranger flinched slightly, but when Lila's hand brushed his fur, he stilled. Hours later, the storm broke. The air grew heavy with that clean smell only rain can leave behind. Elena had fallen asleep in a chair, and Mrs. Whitmore dozed with her chin on her chest. Lila remained awake, sitting beside Ranger. His breathing was slow, peaceful. The oil lamp burned low, throwing a soft circle of light around them. "Why did you bring him here, God?" she whispered. "If he's broken?" The only answer was the creak of the roof, the sigh of the forest. Yet somewhere inside that silence, she felt a warmth, quiet, unexplainable. Maybe this was the lesson her father had written about. Maybe some lives were sent not to be perfect, but to show how love looks when it refuses to quit. By morning, the world was washed clean. Mist curled around the pines, and sunlight spilled through the window in long gold stripes. Ranger woke first, stretching carefully. When he stood, a wobble passed through his legs, but he stayed upright. Lila laughed softly in disbelief. Mrs. Whitmore smiled. "Told you, fighters, the both of you." Elena brewed coffee and set out bread and honey. "He'll need rest. No long walks for a few days." "I'll stay with him," Lila said quickly. "You always do," Elena murmured with affection, though there was pride beneath her fatigue. That afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore returned carrying a folder she had found at the vet's archive. "Thought you might want to see this." She spread the papers on the table. Old records, vaccination slips, a faded tag with Ranger's serial number. The letterhead read, "National Service Canine Program." Lila's eyes scanned the lines until one sentence caught her breath. "Removed from active training due to seizure episodes. Recommended euthanasia." She looked up, her face pale. "They were going to—" "Yes," Mrs. Whitmore interrupted gently. "But someone must have refused. He ended up at that auction instead." Lila sat back, her heart pounding. "So, that's why he was afraid. That's why he wouldn't eat. Elena placed her hand over her daughter's. And that's why he needs you now. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of wind moving through the trees was the only thing between them. Then Lila said quietly, "Maybe he was never meant to save people in a storm. Maybe he was meant to teach me how to survive one." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes shone. "You sound like your father." Over the next days, Ranger's strength returned. He followed Lila around the cabin, tail swishing, steps cautious but steady. The seizures did not return, though sometimes he'd pause and stare into the distance, lost in some memory no human could see. One evening, Lila found him lying beneath her father's old rescue jacket. She smiled through tears, knelt beside him, and whispered, "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to stay." He lifted his head and pressed his muzzle against her shoulder. It wasn't a miracle in the way stories tell it. It was smaller, humbler, and far more real. By the end of the week, the weather had cleared. The sun burned high, drying the last puddles in the yard. Lila hung laundry on the line, while Ranger dozed under the porch. The world seemed, for once, to be breathing easy. When Mrs. Whitmore came by later, carrying a basket of apples, she said, "He's looking better than I've ever seen him." Lila smiled. "He still shakes sometimes, but I think he's healing. And maybe I am too." The older woman squeezed her shoulder. "That's the thing about broken things, dear. When they heal, they're often stronger where they cracked." That night, after prayers, Lila lay awake listening to the crickets. Ranger slept beside her bed, one paw twitching gently in his dreams. The storm had taken its fury and gone, leaving only the quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like grace. By the time July reached its full heat, Silver Pine shimmered like a postcard from another world. White fences gleaming, the scent of lemonade and cotton candy drifting through the air, laughter carrying on the wind. Every year, the townspeople gathered for the summer jubilee, a tradition as old as the town itself. This year, for the first time since her father's death, Lila convinced her mother to go. "It's just for a few hours," she pleaded. "We'll take Ranger. He's better now." Elena hesitated at first. She still avoided crowds, the small talk, the sideways looks of sympathy that people didn't mean to give, but gave anyway. Yet when she looked at her daughter, hair braided, eyes bright, a quiet hope in her voice, she couldn't say no. "All right," she said. "We'll go, but only until sunset." The morning light spilled through the pines as they walked down the gravel road. Ranger trotted beside Lila, wearing a simple blue bandana that Mrs. Whitmore had sewn for him, the word "Hope" embroidered in careful stitches across it. His gait was steady now, his fur glossy beneath the sun. Only his eyes held that deep, knowing calm. An old soul in a young body. Silver Pine Park was alive with color. Balloons nodded at every post, banners rippling from the gazebo, fiddles playing near the lemonade stand. Lila breathed it in like a miracle. For so long, her world had been small, the cabin, the woods, the silence of grief. But today, it felt open again. Children darted between booths, their laughter high and clear. The scent of popcorn and fried dough mingled with the sharper smell of pine resin and horses. Near the center of the park, a brass band played "You Are My Sunshine." And for the first time in months, Elena found herself humming along. Lila knelt to adjust Ranger's collar. "You ready, boy?" she whispered. His ears twitched at her voice, and his tail brushed the grass. At first, everything was easy. People smiled when they saw Ranger, some stopping to pet him, others commenting on how handsome he was. A few recognized Lila as the girl who bought that broken shepherd from the auction. She didn't mind. She only smiled, proud of the quiet strength beside her. Then, somewhere near the pie stall, it happened. A shrill cry cut through the air. Not fear at first, but confusion. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, stood frozen near the cotton candy stand, hands clamped over his ears, eyes wide with panic. His name was Noah Caldwell, though Lila didn't know it yet. The music, the chatter, the sudden cheer of fireworks had become too much for him. He trembled violently, gasping, unable to form words. His mother dropped to her knees beside him, calling his name, but he didn't respond. The band kept playing, unaware. The crowd murmured, unsure what to do. And then, without command or cue, Ranger moved. He slipped free of Lila's hand like a shadow and trotted toward the boy. Lila started after him, but Elena's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Wait," she whispered. Ranger approached slowly, head low, tail relaxed. The crowd held its breath. Noah's mother looked up, startled, but didn't move. The German shepherd stopped a few feet away, then took one step closer, then another, until his muzzle was level with the boy's trembling hands. Noah flinched at first. Then Ranger did something small, almost imperceptible. He lowered himself fully to the ground, belly pressed to the grass, eyes soft, waiting. The boy blinked through tears, uncertain. "Good boy," Lila whispered, her voice shaking. The boy's breathing slowed. His gaze fell on Ranger's eyes, steady, gentle, amber like morning light through honey. After a moment, his fingers unclenched, reaching forward. He brushed the dog's fur once, then again. The change was instant and complete. The trembling eased. His shoulders dropped. The noise of the crowd faded behind him. For the first time since the panic began, Noah exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that ended in silence. And then, with the simplicity of a child who doesn't need permission to love, he wrapped his arms around Ranger's neck. The park fell utterly still. When the boy finally whispered, his voice was so soft it carried only to those closest. "He understands me." The mother covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. Lila's throat closed. She felt something bright and holy swell behind her ribs. Elena reached for her daughter's hand and squeezed. "That's your father's spirit," she said, voice trembling, working through him. Mrs. Whitmore, standing near the lemonade stand, wiped her glasses, though her eyes were already clear. "That dog," she murmured, "wasn't made to be perfect. He was made to heal." The local newspaper photographer caught the moment. The boy's small hands clutching the shepherd's fur, the dog's patient stillness. The crowd gathered like witnesses to something larger than themselves. The photo would appear on the front page 2 days later, under the headline, "Healing in Silver Pine Park." That afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the mayor approached the moors. "That's one remarkable animal you've got," he said, shaking Elena's hand. "You ever think about having him certified as a therapy dog? We could use more of that kind of miracle around here." Elena glanced at Lila, who was brushing a streak of grass from Ranger's coat. "It's not my miracle," she said softly. "It's theirs." Within weeks, the story spread across the county. Families with children on the spectrum began visiting the Moore's cabin. Ranger met them all with the same quiet grace, never forcing contact, never demanding attention, simply offering his presence until trust grew like sunlight through a window. Elena and Lila learned to guide sessions under Mrs. Whitmore's watch. They built small wooden benches in the yard, where children could sit and read or paint beside Ranger. Some talked, some didn't. It didn't matter. Ranger understood silence better than anyone. One afternoon, Noah returned with his mother. He carried a handmade card, a drawing of himself and Ranger under a blue sky. Above it, in crooked letters, he had written, "Thank you for hearing me, when no one else could." Lila hung the card on the wall beside her father's rescue jacket. "He would have loved this," she whispered. Elena nodded. "He would have called it what it is, a calling." At the end of summer, the Silver Pine Chronicle published a feature story about the miracle dog. Local donations began pouring in to support therapy programs for children. Ranger's picture hung in the library, in the post office, even in the church bulletin under the verse, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." But Lila didn't see fame. She saw redemption. She saw a creature once marked as unfit, teaching a town what wholeness really meant. On the last night of the festival season, as fireworks bloomed above the pines, Lila sat on the hill behind the park. Ranger lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. "Do you think Dad sees this?" she asked softly. Elena smiled, watching the sky light up. "I think he never missed a moment." Ranger stirred, his amber eyes catching the reflection of the fireworks. For an instant, Lila swore she saw something deeper, something eternal, shining there. When the final spark faded and the town settled into stillness, she leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding us." He didn't move, only breathed a long, contented sigh, the kind that sounds like peace returning home. That night, long after the last lantern flickered out, the wind carried across Silverpine not the echo of celebration, but something gentler, the whisper of hope being reborn. By the time autumn arrived in Silverpine, the air carried that clean, sharp smell of pine sap and chimney smoke. The town had begun to settle after the excitement of summer. The children were back in school. The banners from the festival had long been taken down. But the story of Ranger, the miracle dog who had calmed the frightened boy, still lingered like a warm echo. People waved to Lila on the street now, stopping her mother at the market to ask how the shepherd was doing. It felt strange, all this attention. Kind, but strange. In their small cabin beneath the ridge, life returned to a rhythm of quiet gratitude. Mornings began with mist and ended with the steady hum of crickets. Ranger spent his days lying by the porch, sometimes accompanying Mrs. Whitmore on her errands, sometimes following Lila to the edge of the woods. He had grown stronger, his coat shining with health, though his gait retained a faint stiffness in cold weather. He was calmer now, content, as if the storm inside him had finally found its still water. But peace rarely lasts untested. One afternoon, a stranger came to town. He introduced himself as Dr. Malcolm Harris, thin, graying at the temples, his suit too formal for Silverpine. He carried himself with the polite confidence of men who are used to being listened to. He met Lila and her mother after Sunday service, smiling with professional warmth. "I read about your dog," he said, his voice smooth, his handshake cold. "Truly remarkable. I run a private research institute, the Harris Center for Animal Rehabilitation. We specialize in behavior recovery and therapy dogs. I believe Ranger might be an ideal subject for our new program." Elena, polite but cautious, thanked him and said they weren't looking to send Ranger anywhere. Dr. Harris only smiled wider. "Oh, I'm not suggesting you give him up. Merely that we study him, fund his care, provide training facilities. Think of it as sponsorship." Lila's instincts, sharp and wordless, prickled. There was something in his eyes, something that looked not at Ranger as a soul, but as a specimen. She forced a smile. "We'll think about it." He tipped his hat, leaving his business card with embossed silver letters. The moment he turned away, Ranger growled low, a sound Lila had never heard from him before. That night, she told Mrs. Whitmore about the meeting. The older woman frowned deeply. "Harris," she said slowly. "I remember that name. There was a Dr. Harris connected with the National Service Canine Program years ago, the one that disposed of unfit dogs." Elena's face went pale. "You think it's the same man?" "Men like that don't change their skin, only their address," Whitmore replied grimly. "Keep an eye on him." For several days, nothing happened. Life went on as before. Ranger began assisting Mrs. Whitmore with her new community therapy sessions for children, sitting patiently beside each visitor. Even Noah came again, now able to laugh freely when Ranger nudged his hand with a paw. Lila loved those afternoons, the sound of children's voices, the sight of sunlight flickering through the trees, the quiet pride in her mother's smile. Then came the night of the fire. It was one of those early autumn evenings that carried a deceptive calm. The wind was restless but not harsh, the sky clear except for a faint haze near the ridge. Lila had just gone to bed when Ranger's bark split the silence, sharp, frantic, the sound of alarm. She bolted upright. "Mom!" Elena ran from her room. Outside, orange light flickered through the trees. The training shed, the old one her father had built, was ablaze. The dry wood had caught fast. Flames leapt along the walls, devouring the roof with terrifying speed. "Ranger's still out there!" Lila screamed. She ran before Elena could stop her, bare feet pounding through the cold grass. Smoke stung her eyes as she reached the clearing. The air roared like a living thing. Through the heat and chaos, she saw him, Ranger, inside the shed, barking not at the fire, but at something beneath a fallen beam. "Ranger, come out!" she shouted, choking on the smoke. He didn't move. He kept barking, desperate toward the corner. Lila hesitated only a moment before covering her face with her sleeve and pushing through the door. The air was thick and burning. She followed Ranger's gaze and saw it. An old wooden trunk, half hidden under debris. Her father's trunk, the one she hadn't touched since his death. "Come on," she gasped, dragging it toward the door. The beam above groaned. Ranger seized the edge of her shirt in his teeth, pulling her backward just as part of the ceiling gave way. They stumbled into the cold night air as the structure collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks. Elena rushed forward, wrapping her arms around them both. Ranger coughed and shook himself, soot darkening his fur. The trunk lay at their feet, scorched but intact. Inside, when they pried it open, was her father's original field notebook, more detailed than the one Lila had read. And within the pages, tucked among old photographs, were official documents stamped with a seal she recognized. National Service Canine Division. The reports told everything. Ranger had indeed been part of their experimental therapy program. Dr. Malcolm Harris had overseen the project, which had forced dogs through unethical stress conditions to enhance obedience. When Ranger's seizures began, Harris ordered him retired, permanently. Someone, a sympathetic handler perhaps, had disobeyed and sent him to the auction instead. Lila stared at the papers, tears streaming through the soot on her cheeks. "He wanted to destroy this," she whispered. "That's why he came back. He was trying to cover it up." Elena touched her shoulder gently, and Ranger stopped him. The police arrived within the hour. The fire chief confirmed what they already suspected. The blaze had been deliberate. Accelerants found near the shed. Witnesses later reported seeing a car speeding away down the service road, a dark sedan matching Dr. Harris's rental. But by the time a warrant was issued, he was gone. Lila sat beside Ranger on the porch steps as dawn broke, her hand resting on his back. His fur smelled faintly of smoke and rain. "You saved us again," she said softly. Mrs. Whitmore arrived carrying bandages and coffee. "The Lord has strange ways," she said, examining Ranger's singed fur. "That dog has more purpose in his bones than most men I've met." Elena stood nearby, holding her husband's charred notebook close to her chest. "Maybe," she said, "this was his way of protecting what Nathan started." Lila turned toward the light growing behind the trees. "No," she said, her voice steady. "This is only the beginning. The fire destroyed the old training shed completely, but from its ashes came something new. With the help of townspeople and donations from families Ranger had helped, they planned to rebuild. A center not of experiments, but of healing." That night, as the last embers cooled, Lila watched the flames fade into soft gray. The wind carried the scent of pine and smoke. She thought of Dr. Harris, of his polished smile and empty eyes, and felt no hatred, only pity. "He doesn't understand," she murmured. "You can't burn what's built from love." Ranger, lying beside her, lifted his head and leaned against her arm. His tail brushed the porch once, slow, content. The stars above Silverpine flickered like promises kept. In the distance, church bells began to ring for morning service. Their echo rolled through the valley like a benediction. And beneath that sound, in the hush that followed, the girl and her dog sat together, two souls marked by loss, redeemed by faith, and unbroken by fire. Winter had returned to Silverpine quietly, not with storms or fury, but with a hush that wrapped the valley in white peace. Snow lay soft on the rooftops, frosting the pines until they glittered like cathedrals of light. Down the main road, where Christmas wreaths hung from lampposts and smoke curled from brick chimneys, the people of Silverpine were preparing for something new, something born not from tragedy, but from faith. On the hill beyond the church, where the old training shed had once stood in ashes, carpenters and volunteers worked together through the cold. The air smelled of pine, sawdust, and hope. A new building was taking shape, pale timber beams, wide windows to catch the morning sun, and a small bronze plaque already waiting to be placed by the door. It read, simply, Ranger's Hope Center. Lila stood in the snow beside her mother, scarf wrapped high around her chin. She was taller now, older not in years, but in soul. Her eyes still carried the wild blue brightness of belief, though there was something steadier behind them, wisdom shaped by loss and grace. Ranger sat beside her, his thick winter coat glowing under the weak sunlight, breath fogging the air in slow puffs. His amber eyes followed the workers, every hammer strike reflected in their calm depths. Mrs. Whitmore, bundled in her thick coat, clapped her gloved hands. "It's coming together faster than I expected. The Lord must be sending us strong hands this winter." Elena smiled, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Faith builds faster than fear ever could. The town had rallied after the fire. Donations poured in, some from locals who remembered Ranger's miracle at the park, others from faraway towns that had read about him in the papers. The story had spread beyond Silverpine, the rescued dog who became a rescuer, but the Moores hadn't used the attention for themselves. Every cent went into the center. They had one simple vision, to make it a place where broken things could find purpose again. Inside the half-finished building, the scent of new wood mingled with faint traces of paint. Lila walked along the main hall, imagining what it would look like when finished. "Here," she said, pointing toward a window that framed the ridge. "This will be the therapy room. Big windows so the kids can see the mountains." "And here," Elena added, touching the opposite wall, "we'll keep the kennels warm, just enough space for every dog to feel safe, but never caged." Ranger padded beside them, tail swaying gently. When they stopped, he looked up at Lila, as if asking, "Is this home again?" "Yes," she whispered. "This time, it's for you." That afternoon, snow began to fall harder, thick flakes tumbling like blessings from the clouds. The workers packed up early, promising to return at dawn. As the last truck rolled down the hill, the world turned quiet. Only wind, snow, and the faint creak of pines bending under the weight of grace. Lila sat on the steps of the unfinished center, her mittened hands cupped around a steaming mug of cocoa. Ranger lay at her feet, his head resting on her boots. "Do you think Dad would have liked this?" she asked softly. Elena joined her, setting down her own mug. "He dreamed of something like it," she said, "a place where people and animals could heal each other. He just didn't know he'd have to leave it for you to finish." The words warmed more deeply than the cocoa could. As night fell, the snow thickened, muffling the world into silence. The lights of Silverpine twinkled below like candles on an altar. Lila traced her finger across the fresh snow on the railing, writing one word: hope. Ranger lifted his head, as if recognizing it. He leaned closer, pressing his nose against the letters until they blurred. When spring came, the thaw revealed not just grass, but renewal. The Rangers' Hope Center opened its doors on the first clear day of April. The townspeople gathered under bunting and ribbons, their cheeks rosy with the bite of lingering cold. The mayor stood at a small podium, adjusting his hat nervously before speaking. "Silverpine has seen its share of loss," he began. "But sometimes, God sends us a reminder that no story ends in ashes unless we stop believing. Today, we open a place built from faith, courage, and a very good dog." The crowd laughed gently, applause rippling through the air. Lila stepped forward with Ranger, holding the ribbon scissors. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from reverence. She looked around, at Mrs. Whitmore beaming through tears, at her mother standing proud, at the children waiting with bright eyes, and said, "Ranger wasn't born perfect. He was born to prove that healing doesn't come from strength, but from love." Then she cut the ribbon. The cheer that followed seemed to lift the valley itself. Inside, sunlight poured through wide windows, glinting off polished wood floors. The therapy room smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. On one wall hung photographs: Ranger at the park with Noah, Ranger beside Mrs. Whitmore, Ranger asleep under the firelight. Beneath them, carved into a plaque, were her father's words: "The truest training begins with love." Children began to visit that very week. Some came shy and silent, others came trembling with fear of the world. Ranger greeted each with patience. He would sit quietly, letting them come to him, eyes soft as prayer. The children seemed to sense it, that invisible bridge between pain and peace. Within minutes, laughter would fill the room again. One boy, missing a leg after an accident, leaned against Ranger's back as he practiced balance. Another, who had not spoken for months, whispered his first word into Ranger's ear. Each time, Lila stood by watching, her heart swelling with something wordless. The miracles weren't loud anymore. They were steady, small, and real. That evening, after the last family left, Lila stayed behind to tidy the room. Ranger followed her, as he always did. When she bent to switch off the lamp, she noticed him staring at the plaque. His ears twitched, his head tilted slightly as if he understood what was written there. "You did it, boy," she said softly. "You turned every scar into light." Ranger wagged his tail once and pressed his head gently against her leg. Outside, Dusk painted the valley in gold and violet. The last snow melted on the mountain peaks, and from somewhere in the distance came the faint toll of church bells. Elena waited by the car, watching her daughter lock the doors of the new center. "You've given him a home," she said. Lila smiled. "He gave it to us first." They drove home in silence, the kind of silence that holds music inside it. When they reached the cabin, Lila turned back to look once more at the glowing windows of Ranger's Hope Center. The light spilling through looked almost like sunrise. Ranger, lying in the back seat, lifted his head, ears pricking toward the sound of distant laughter. His eyes caught the light, amber, steady, full of grace. Lila reached back to touch his paw. "Rest now," she whispered. "Your work's done." But deep down, she knew it wasn't really done. Not while there were still broken hearts in need of mending. Not while love still had hands and paws to do God's quiet work. As they disappeared down the snowy road, a verse from her father's notebook lingered in her mind. "The Lord rebuilds what the fire takes. The ashes only mark where faith was tested." And in that moment, beneath a sky streaked with the last light of day, Lila felt it again. The presence of her father, of every kindness ever given, and of the quiet heartbeat beside her that had carried them through it all. Ranger's tail thumped softly once, twice against the seat. Outside, the stars began to appear, silent witnesses to a story not of endings, but of beginnings made new. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not thunder and lightning from the sky, but the quiet ways God mends what was broken. He sends love through the hands that rescue, through the hearts that forgive, and through the faithful souls, like Ranger and Lila, who remind us that healing is real. In our own lives, God still works in the small moments, when we choose kindness over anger, hope over fear, and love over judgment. If this story touched your heart, share it to remind someone that faith still lives in this world. Leave a comment below, tell us what you believe about miracles, and type "Amen" if you pray for God to bless every home watching tonight.